very happy to introduce Jenna Corcoran, who's going to be presenting thesis research called Rebuilding and Finding Meaning in a Digital Era, How Online Activity Affects Women Experiencing Reproductive Loss. So thank you so much, Jenna, for coming, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, everyone can hear me and see me okay? Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to take a moment, welcome everyone, and thank you all for being here and giving me the opportunity to present my research to you. My name is Jenna Corcoran, and today I'll be sharing my research, Rebuilding and Finding Meaning in a Digital Era, How Online Activity Affects Women Experiencing Reproductive Loss. Before I begin, I want to start by respectfully acknowledging that this research was conducted on the traditional territories of the First Nation and Métis people in what is now Saskatchewan. I recognize the profound and lasting harms caused by historical and contemporary policies and medical practices, particularly in relation to reproductive health and autonomy. I honor the strength and resilience and voices of the Indigenous communities whose experiences of reproductive loss, trauma, and healing continue to inform and guide our understanding of reproductive care and justice. Okay, so here is quickly what to expect from our short time together today. I'll provide a brief explanation of each of the sections of my written thesis and consider the key findings that emerged from the participants' stories. I just want to let you guys know that I will be going over the theory and methodology section pretty quickly. And I will take some time at the end of that section in case anyone wants some clarification of what I did and how I got to the findings, but I didn't want to spend too much time there just in the interest of telling the participants' stories and doing those justice. So, and I will of course close with what the research means for practice and any future opportunities for research, and we'll have some discussion around that. Okay, so once upon a time, in a land not so far away, a woman found out she was pregnant with a little boy named Emerson, and she was incredibly happy. It's here in the not so happily ever after story that this research finds its roots. In my own personal reproductive loss experience, as well as my professional background supporting women in various stages of their own reproductive journey. The faded image in the background of this slide is from my own loss experience. I included it intentionally to situate myself within the narrative landscape of this work and provide transparency into my own story. The importance of this research is really rooted in giving space to stories that don't fit with traditional narratives of motherhood or grief, and to provide insight into how the digital terrain can be navigated to support the process of grieving following an experience of reproductive loss. So these personal experiences that I shared with you, they brought me to the literature, and that's where it all began, but it's not where the story ends. But before we begin, I want to start with a question. What does society say the path to parenthood looks like? If you think about messages we absorb from movies, social media, maybe we've witnessed them within our own communities, within our own families, it often looks pretty straightforward. You grow up, you meet someone, you decide you're ready, you try, you get pregnant, and you have a baby. A clear path. A predictable sequence, I would say, a destination that feels pretty inevitable. Now, I want you guys to think personally, what did you imagine that path would look like for you, if you ever even imagined that path? Maybe it was timed, maybe it felt certain, maybe it felt joyful and linear. And now the harder question. What does the path actually look like? For some, it does unfold in that very expected way. But for many, and more than we openly talk about in our society, the path bends. It can stall, it can detour, or sometimes it just ends abruptly. There can be silence where there was supposed to be celebration, isolation where there's supposed to be community, uncertainty where there was supposed to be progress. The reality is that the path to parenthood isn't universal. It's not guaranteed, and it's not always visible to others. Today, I want to talk about what happens when the expected path changes, how people experience it, how we respond to it, and how we as friends, family members, colleagues, and professionals within each of our roles can better support those navigating a path that doesn't look the way that we were told it's supposed to. Uh-oh. No, don't kick me out. Technological snafu. Pause briefly. Okay, it might be kicking me out. Sorry, guys. Let me. Geez, talk about disrupting my narrative flow. Okay. Oh. Hmm.
Would you like me to just share it on my screen?
Well, I'm just trying one thing to get this going, and then if I can't make it work, then we might have to do that. So, okay. Are we back in business? Do you guys see that? Okay, hopefully it doesn't do that again. I'll get caught up here. Oh. Okay, so my research focused on these two primary questions, and it's important to note that each of these questions invited a narrative approach, one that doesn't seek to generalize, and that's an important factor when I explain these stories of my participants to you. It's not about generalization, it's about to understand experience as lived and told. My goal wasn't to find universal truths, but to explore the depth and diversity of stories that help reveal how women make sense of and rebuild identity, community, and meaning after a reproductive loss. So to go briefly into the literature review, I want to start by acknowledging that there are many more instances of reproductive loss that fall outside of these three categories of perinatal loss that the Public Health Agency of Canada references. So just to go over those a little bit, loss that occurs during a traumatic birth experience in which the baby lives, losses that occur during the postpartum period due to postpartum depression or mood disorders, and non-traditional losses that happen within and throughout the reproductive journey, just to name a few. But for the interests of this research, and the interest of narrowing the focus of the research, I chose to focus on these three categories as identified by the Public Health Agency of Canada. And that's loss occurring prior to pregnancy, during pregnancy, and after birth, which the diverse experiences that exist in these three alone are marked by unique emotional, physical, and social challenges within the grieving process. So the pro-natalist and neoliberal ideologies also impact the experience of reproductive loss and have influenced and continue to impact societal expectations of womanhood and motherhood, as well as pregnancy and reproduction. So I really want to illustrate these two ideologies with a bit of a story. When I was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, a boy in my class used to make fun of me because I couldn't say my R sound properly. I came home one day completely devastated in a very dramatic fashion. I said, well, I'm never getting married. And my mom was very supportive, and she smiled and said, well, what about kids? And I said, ick, who wants kids? And she laughed very gently and said, oh, you will one day. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't oppressive. It was loving, ordinary, felt very familiar, but it was also pronatalism in action. The assumption was if I would want kids, it was when. My future had already been written, and layered inside that assumption is something even quieter. Today, we don't just assume that motherhood will happen. We assume it can be managed, planned, achieved. With the rise of assisted reproductive technologies, IVF, egg freezing, fertility treatment, the cultural message has shifted to, if you want it badly enough, there's a way. There's another round, another option, another intervention. Motherhood becomes both inevitable and an individual responsibility. And when you combine those two forces, pronatalism and neoliberalism, something subtle but powerful happens. If you don't want children, what's wrong with you? If you can't have children, what went wrong? And if you experience loss, what did you do? Even when no one says it out loud, that question can live internally. And this is where disenfranchised grief and meaning making lives. Because if motherhood is assumed and responsibility is individualized, then reproductive loss isn't just grief. It can feel like failure, like deviance from a script, like something that doesn't quite deserve public mourning. The loss isn't always fully recognized. The identity disruption is rarely validated, and the grief can go underground. And when the script you were handed since childhood suddenly fractures, meaning making becomes complicated. Not just how do I grieve this pregnancy, but who am I? What does motherhood look like now? Where do I belong if the story I was promised changes? Meaning making is the process of untangling identity from expectation, of rewriting a narrative that once felt predetermined. And that is the deeper terrain this work is exploring, moving away from the staged models of detachment to the dynamic and relational process of grieving and rebuilding found within meaning making and continuing bonds theory. It's also important to recognize that within the research, digital spaces have fundamentally changed how we experience reproduction and grief. The literature shows that online spaces are not inherently helpful or harmful. They can be both, offering avenues for connection and validation, as well as challenges associated with visibility, self-disclosure, and the rising influence of algorithms and echo chambers. So that brings me to the gap. My research explores the gap where there is limited research related to how online engagement impacts maternal identity formation and the meaning-making process for women navigating reproductive grief. This research project is intended to gain an in-depth understanding of how the 3 participants experience reproductive grief and reconstruct their maternal identities within contemporary social and technological landscapes. Narrative inquiry allowed me to explore not simply each woman's maternal identity, but how their identity had changed, grown, and evolved over time, how it was constructed within the settings of both their offline and online world, and how it was impacted by relationships and connections within each of these settings. If you guys notice, the font that is at the bottom of the page, so usually within some slides, there is some font at the bottom of the page. Those are just direct excerpts from my thesis itself. So in this case, in one of the interview processes, I noticed that I was truly walking alongside the participant's story and witnessing an evolving concept that was being supported by the narrative process. So every time the participants told and retold their story, there were subtle changes within their maternal identity, but then also just their wider identity as well as they participated. So I found that very interesting just as part of the process of the research. Okay, so now the theory and methodology section. So why qualitative inquiry? I selected this method of inquiry because it's inductive and allows for the deep exploration of the participants' personal experiences. In particular, it emphasizes the meaning that participants attribute to those experiences, which is an important element of the research. I also paired that with social constructivist lens, as I was able to consider how the three women's stories, identity, and meaning-making process were constructed, repaired, and reconstructed over time. This was important in the research goals and allowed me to attend to the complex evolution of reproductive grief as both dynamically individual and a cultural phenomenon. By bringing narrative inquiry in with the social constructivism, I could explore how digital spaces both reproduce and resist dominant narratives about motherhood and how women find agency and autonomy within those constraints. Narrative inquiry not only focuses on the experience of the individual, but also on the social, cultural, and institutional narratives which shape their experiences. So going a little bit into the method of collection, it was important throughout the process that I ensured that each of these steps were in keeping with the narrative inquiry approach that I had chose. The participants were recruited using a Qualtrics survey link that was posted on social media platforms. The criteria for participation were that women had to have experienced reproductive loss within the past 5 years, and they had to be active on social media platforms before, during, and after their loss experience. The 3 participants that I recruited were all between the ages of 32 to 45, which wasn't a requirement, but interestingly enough, they all fell within that age demographic. And they had all experienced both pregnancy loss and ongoing fertility-related issues. Again, not a requirement that they fall into those 2 categories, but interestingly enough, that's what was recruited. I interviewed each woman twice, and the interviews took place over a period of 2 months. They were about 45 minutes to 60 minutes each, and the participant identified the preference as to whether the location or whether they were virtual. 1 participant chose in person in her home, and 2 participants chose virtual interviews. Initial transcripts were sent to the participants for review, and transcripts, field notes, and my own reflexive journaling were used in the story analysis. Okay, so this is just a quick snapshot of mapping the analytical process. So I'll go over it quickly. Gathering the stories occurred using narrative interviews, and ongoing self-reflexivity and member checking helped to ensure validity throughout the process. And once I had the stories, I was able to immerse myself in the content and discover broader patterns of meaning. Within the narrative process, it was really about reading and listening to the stories multiple times, which gave me that initial understanding of each story. And it also helped me to familiarize with the structure of the story, where it began, plot patterns, turning points that individuals identified in their own story, and then also any broader cultural discourses that were present or influencing the story at any given time. So memoing these stories strengthened the process and helped to identify reoccurring themes, moments of resonance, and turning points within each narrative. Okay, so these are just a few of the research considerations that I had in mind throughout. I remained aware of the limitations, ethical concerns, and risk of the research for the participants, recognizing that the limitations of the theoretical lens as well as the method of study was important. The lens and approach I used in this research were no less valid. However, it does change the focus of the findings, and that's important to have out there, ensuring that all ethical considerations and risk management guidelines were followed, including the protection of confidentiality, the use of informed consent, consideration of the power imbalances that naturally exist within the participant and researcher dynamic, as well as managing my own positionality, and debriefing regularly was also important. And that happened throughout the interview process at the beginning and end of each interview, as well as throughout the time in between interviews, as well as the participants needed. Okay, so right now, actually, before I go into that, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions. I kind of flew through that pretty quickly. Did anybody have any questions about the theory or methodology? Anything that they would like clarification on? No? Okay. If it does come up for you as I move on, take a note and we'll discuss it at the end as well. So there'll be time then as well. Okay, so what did I find? I want to begin with an excerpt from each participant's initial reflections on the question of how does social media engagement have a place within your loss journey? So with that, within these accounts, connection and belonging, validation of their experience, witnessing and maintaining hope, and a general exploration of alternative narrative frameworks surrounding motherhood, digital nurturing, and family structure can be found. These provide us with an excellent jumping off point to introduce the similarities within the stories, as well as a brief glimpse into the nuance and uniqueness in each of the women's reproductive journeys. Okay. So I found in the writing process, as well as just in understanding the stories, that the uniqueness of each story is best attended to individually. So I will start with Sarah's story, which is where I began in the interview process as well. And it unfolded as a narrative of nurturing and caring, but also of feeling pushed to the side. She described being caught in the in-between, not fitting into society's categories of mother or non-mother, and feeling invalidated and unsupported by existing healthcare support. Sarah was the only participant in this study who did not have a living child at the time of the interviews. She had experienced a miscarriage of twins and identified ongoing issues getting pregnant. She was also the only one who had not pursued assisted reproductive technologies, not because she didn't want to, but because timing, financial limitations, and limited social support and structural barriers made those pathways inaccessible for her. And that positioned her in what she repeatedly described as that in-between spot. She wanted to be a mother, and she maintained a bond with her twins throughout, but without a living child and without access to expensive fertility treatments, she felt pushed to the side by the healthcare systems, by policy structures, and by dominant narratives that prioritize women who are able to take all the steps. And that's her direct quote, take all the steps. Remember, in a culture shaped by pronatalism, motherhood is expected. And in a neoliberal system, it's also individualized and financially mediated. And Sarah did not have equal access to that pathway. What makes her story particularly interesting is that she was also the only participant who posted publicly on her personal Facebook page about her miscarriage. While others shared within private groups, Sarah made her invisible loss visible within her broader community. That act wasn't just disclosure. It was resistance, a public claim to motherhood. Social media provided both validation and friction for her. It allowed her to witness alternative models of motherhood, adoption, fostering, later in life parenting. It also allowed her to maintain hope, but it also amplified the gap between what she could see happening online and what was financially and structurally available to her offline. Sarah's story shows us that meaning making for some women, it's not just about grief. It's about sustaining identity when access is unequal. And it's about claiming a maternal identity in a world that often measures motherhood biologically and economically. So the next story is Brandy's story, and her story of motherhood was a huge spectrum story, one of resilience and adaptability. She often described herself as the rock, someone who stayed strong for others while navigating her own grief privately. From early in her relationship, she and her husband knew their path to parenthood would not follow a traditional trajectory. Because of aggressive cancer treatments he had received as a child, they began their reproductive journey in medical spaces, IUI appointments, consultations, waiting rooms. And during that same season, her brother passed away from suicide. Brandy described in that season becoming the rock for her family, the dependable one, the strong one. But rocks aren't known for their softness or their vulnerability. She felt she had to perform wellness to hold others together while quietly navigating her own grief. Comments like, "You're not a mom," or "You don't get it," pushed her to expand her definition of motherhood beyond biology. Throughout her story, she insisted, you can be a mother if your child existed for a few hours or a few weeks, or if you want to have a child one day, or if you nurture in other ways. Motherhood became an identity for her across time, not just a present condition. In 2024, she gave birth to her daughter, and she described being in the thick of parenting. Her definition of motherhood didn't change, but it did deepen. Her daughter also changed her online presence. Even in Joy, she started second-guessing posting photos. She worried about gloating and remembered how painful it felt when she viewed those images. Navigating social media was complex, and it became a testing ground for her maternal identity. In infertility groups, she could explore the technical and emotional layers of treatment. In local groups, she found practical support. And in broader communities, she witnessed a spectrum of motherhood stories. These spaces validated her experiences, but they also created painful comparison points. Easy pregnancy announcements, postpartum bodies, parenting strategies. She described sometimes needing to change gears or get off social media to protect herself. But she also described it as an archive, a place where she could look back and see growth and continuity. And she could see that motherhood existed before and after physical milestones. Brandy's story shows that motherhood isn't binary or limited to success or failure. It's layered, it's temporal, and it's negotiated. And sometimes expanding the definition is actively resisting dominant cultural scripts. So my final story was Amy, who frequently described herself as a mother hen, which is a phrase that beautifully captured her story of protection, guidance, and communal care. When we first started talking, she described motherhood in fairly traditional terms, wanting that biological connection that comes with a baby growing inside you. She had experienced a miscarriage before the birth of her son, conceived after 7 rounds of fertility treatments. And now, in her 40s, she was still hoping for a second child, navigating fertility treatments and a chemical pregnancy along the way. But as she told and retold her story, within this interview process, something shifted. Her narrative around motherhood was different. She said, well, I'm kind of a mother hen to everybody. And her definition of motherhood expanded. She was a mother to her 10-year-old son, the children on her school bus, the 25-year-old international billet whose mother was in Germany. She nurtured nieces and nephews and women in online infertility groups. She developed what she described as different levels of mothering: guidance, discipline, flexibility, love, support. At the center was her son, but radiating outward was a web of maternal relationships. Social media played a major role in this evolution for her. Unlike the other women, Amy first turned to online spaces for parenting support, joining a June 2015 baby group that grew alongside her son. Later, she joined PCOS and infertility groups and slowly moved from seeking support to being the one to offer it. Her reproductive losses became a source of maternal authority. These spaces also became a form of resistance. As a woman in her 40s, pursuing pregnancy, she actively sought stories of other women her age becoming pregnant, challenging cultural and medical messages that suggested that her time had passed. She described feeling left behind, and while she embraced an expansive definition of motherhood for others, she acknowledged something deeply honest. She still longed for that biological connection again. That tension between inclusive definitions and personal grief is where her story lives. And pronatalist messaging, comments like, "Your son needs a sibling," added emotional labor rather than comfort. Amy's story showed us that motherhood can be communal, layered, and expansive, but it also shows that even the most generous definitions don't erase longing. Although identity expands, grief remains, and meaning is negotiated over time. Okay, so to summarize, for Sarah, who identified feeling stuck in the in-between and pushed to the side, she felt validated in her preemptive motherhood. Through posting and witnessing other women's journeys, she found a voice to express and explore her identity. For Brandy, who felt like she had to be the rock and perform wellness within her offline reality, specialized online support restored her agency and allowed her to be vulnerable and share more openly about her reproductive journey. And for Amy, whose journey had been the longest, stretching almost 2 decades, her online presence was an opportunity to deepen her mother hen role through digital nurturing and online presence, and offered continuity within this connection, as well as a reference point for hope within her own reproductive journey. Okay, so we've attended to the stories individually. Now let's weave them all together. Across all 3 narratives, there were both unique differences and shared threads. Each woman's experience of reproductive loss and an online engagement reflected her own history, personality, and circumstances. Yet common patterns emerged throughout, especially around the tension between connection and comparison, and between comfort and emotional safety. For example, while online spaces offered understanding and solidarity, they also sometimes triggered pain through comparisons or grief reminders. Participants described balancing this vulnerability very carefully, showing that digital communities can be both supportive and difficult to navigate. In narrative inquiry terms, these differences and overlaps reveal how individual and collective stories can exist together. how meaning is shaped not only by personal experience, but by participation in shared digital narratives. It was in this intersection between difference and commonality that the most powerful insights can be seen. Okay, so this was my favorite part of the research because as these women continued to move through reproductive loss and grief, and in many cases continued trying to grow their families, they did not just passively consume social media content. They became very strategic. And one of the most persistent narratives within the participant stories of reproductive loss was the story of providing support for others who were also on this journey as well. And this led me to ask a final question within the research that I maybe hadn't intended to ask originally. I asked, what strategies would you recommend to other women navigating reproductive loss on social media? And what emerged was not just simple advice. It was wisdom born from lived experience. Okay, so to start off, the women recommended changing gears. Across all three stories, there was one recurring theme: flexibility. Brandy described it as changing gears. She talked about removing certain people from her platforms, not necessarily unfriending, but muting, unfollowing, quietly curating. She explained every day is a different story, and I take it one day at a time. The day-by-day flexibility was key. Amy echoed this when she described knowing when to take a step back. She explained that the impact of social media depends on your frame of mind. On one day, you might be able to take the positive from a pregnancy announcement, while on another, it might feel unbearable. Pay attention. She described recognizing when she was getting too wrapped up and choosing to disengage. The metaphor of changing gears is powerful. Sometimes they shifted into a lower gear, sometimes they reversed, sometimes they parked entirely. In doing so, they reclaimed a small but meaningful sense of agency within their journey. That often felt uncontrollable. They also recommended being careful and considerate. Balance meant becoming highly intentional about how and whether they posted. All three women spoke about navigating what I would call the unwritten grief standards of social media. When is it appropriate to share? How much is too much? What counts as loss worth posting? And what platforms supported disclosure? And how did they feel comfortable disclosing in those environments? Anonymous participation in online support groups became a protective strategy. It allowed them to access community and validation without exposing themselves to unsolicited advice or judgment. Brandy described herself as super cautious, really careful and considerate of what I put out there. She acknowledged a fear of attention, especially if there wasn't a good outcome in her reproductive journey. Amy similarly described being strategic. She often chose not to post about her reproductive journey publicly. Instead, she consumed information quietly and only contributed when she felt she had insight or could benefit someone else. These women intentionally gauged whether they felt like they were oversharing. They were not naive users of technology, and they were thinking critically, managing risk and protecting their own emotional safety, given their own unique social media settings. Another strategy that emerged was reframing why they were online in the first place. Sarah offered simple but powerful advice. Use the search bar. Put in the words that resonate with you. Instead of passively scrolling and absorbing whatever the algorithm delivered, they actively searched for what they needed. IVF success stories, PCOS communities, adoption narratives, women in their 40s getting pregnant. And this changed depending on where they were in their own reproductive journey. This shift from the passive consumption to intentional searching allowed them to retrain their digital environment, and it allowed them to curate hope. And when reproductive content became overwhelming, they pivoted entirely, switching content types, focusing on different interests, and giving their nervous systems a break. Finally, all three participants noticed that offline support matters when engaging online. Their ability to navigate social media was not happening in isolation. Offline support strengthened online resiliency. Amy spoke about her husband's partnership through fertility treatments, emphasizing that this journey was not hers alone. Sarah described supportive coworkers who just let her talk. During her miscarriage, Sarah described supportive coworkers who just let her talk during her miscarriage, and made a meaningful difference. When they felt seen and supported offline, they were better equipped to tolerate the emotional complexity of those online spaces. This balance between offline and online support acted as a stabilizing force. Okay, so in the discussion, a few things stand out, and what really stands out is that the stories connect to what the literature already tells us and extends that knowledge into the digital world, where there is so much potential for and challenge to women's meaning-making process. The findings reinforce the idea that motherhood is a process of becoming, something shaped over time and in relationship. What my research adds is an understanding as to how this unfolds online. Through posting, sharing, and supporting one another, women actively practice and affirm maternal identity in digital spaces. The embodied experience was also central. While existing studies acknowledge the body's role in reproductive loss, the women in this research showed how they navigated online communities to make sense of their bodies as both an ally and a traitor. These platforms became places where they could articulate that ambivalence openly and understand it a little more thoroughly. And the digital environment itself played a role. Algorithms amplified certain emotions and stories, sometimes offering comfort and sometimes creating triggers. This research illustrates that women did not remain passive within echo chambers of grief. They used real agency by curating feeds, joining specific groups, and protecting their emotional boundaries throughout. In addition, their purposeful choice of platform usage shaped the type of support, their depths of storytelling, and the pace of their meaning-making journey entirely. And lastly, the findings also echoed what intersectional feminist theorists remind us of. Structural constraints don't disappear online. They show up in who feels safe posting, whose stories get visibility, and whose grief is validated. In addition, the disconnect between the possibilities depicted online and the offline feasibility added to the complexity of navigating the intersectionality of structural limitations. Okay, so this slide brings the research back into practice and really highlights what it means for those of us working with women and families. The implications matter for anyone in any setting that supports women through fertility challenges, pregnancy loss, or postpartum experiences. Social workers, counselors, nurses, or people in child protection related roles. These professionals are often meeting with women in incredibly vulnerable moments, and understanding their digital lives can strengthen that support at any point along the reproductive journey. I'm going to remind you guys that these findings are not meant to be universal, because the universality of that path to parenthood doesn't exist. But they are meant to be context-rich and transferable. They offer insights for practitioners that you can recognize and that may resonate with you or with a particular patient or client. And it offers you the opportunity to apply them when they see similar patterns in their own work. It's about understanding what meaning making in digital spaces is real, relational, and deeply personal, and that we can support women more fully when we honor that complexity. Okay, so looking ahead, future research could build on this work by exploring larger or more diverse samples. This is a very small sample size, as narrative inquiry is intended for. And it is a very cisgender, certain socioeconomic demographic, and limited to, of course, those 3 different areas of reproductive loss. So there's opportunity to explore what this might look like in a child protection setting where there's so many reproductive losses that are occurring on an ongoing basis through the trauma of apprehension, or the reproductive journey in general. So looking beyond this sample would be an area where we could expand, or also by combining the qualitative and quantitative approaches. So for example, the quantitative could examine patterns of online engagement after loss, while qualitative research continues to explore the depth and meaning behind those patterns. So having that mixed method approach might be valuable. There's also room to look more closely at platform design and algorithms and how they influence visibility, and how digital storytelling might evolve as technology changes. In all cases, the goal remains the same: to better understand how people feel connection, identity, and healing in virtual spaces that feel very real. So with that being said, thank you for spending your lunch hour with me. I'm really glad you could be part of this conversation. And let's talk a little bit about it. How do we support mothers when the journey looks a little more like that top picture rather than that smaller image? That's all I've got.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenna. That was wonderful. If you want to exit out of the presentation, then we can look at each other a little bit more easily. There we go. Yeah, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And we'll open it up to see if anyone has any questions or comments. Okay, I'm not hearing anybody, but I just in listening to you and thinking about just both the people I've seen in practice who are dealing with reproductive loss, and then also just in my own community of friends and family, it's so common. And I don't think we talk enough about how common it is, but it's still so isolating as well. And so I think this engagement with the online world makes so much sense, because there's a lot of stigma in talking about it. And yeah, I'm just curious in your research if you found any statistics in terms of like how many people are dealing with reproductive loss, like in Canada on a given year. Do we know?
It's actually extremely interesting to have those conversations, because what information is out there is actually relatively dated. And it's not, some areas are completely understudied in terms of like whether the statistics are actually legitimate, what those numbers look like. The estimated pregnancy loss is anywhere from 15% to 1 in 4 of pregnancies end in reproductive loss. So hard to know because a lot of them are happening early within pregnancies before women even notice they're pregnant. And then when you think about like just the reproductive losses that occur on an ongoing basis, so like loss due to reproductive trauma or those non-traditional losses that are occurring during the postpartum period because of mood disruption or even like early babies coming and in the NICU and not getting that skin-to-skin contact that a lot of women imagine within their reproductive journey. So when those expectations aren't being met, there's all of these losses, non-traditional losses that are being felt and then not necessarily recorded, or there's no numbers to really capture that for anyone. So it is the 1 in 4 would be 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage is the estimate, but it's not a solid number just because it is such a understudied and under-prioritized area. There's a lot of assumptions around, well, you'll just get pregnant again, or until it actually becomes like an ongoing fertility issue for women, it's very hard to document it. And even in my own, I know when I had Emerson, a doctor made a comment of, "Oh, do you have any kids at home?" And I said, "No." And he's like, "Oh, that's such a shame. It would have made it so much easier for you." And so there's a lot in our medical system, in our support system, there's a lot of messaging that, although well-intentioned, the impact isn't lining up. And I think what I really wanted to do with this research is to help people to recognize when their intent doesn't line up with their impact and how we can start improving the behavior in the in-between to really support people in providing the support they want to support to people they care about or people who they work with. But sometimes you just don't know how to do that. So, and we don't have enough numbers to know the demand to want to do that.
Totally. Yeah. I'm just thinking in my own experience, I had an experience of terminating a pregnancy for a medical reason, unwanted pregnancy. And that itself was fascinating in Saskatchewan, like the lack of support for people with that type of experience. Kind of like an unknown area that wasn't well supported, and similar comments made to me about my age and like what that I'm sure I would be fine. I was just worried because I was old and like things like that that were pretty damaging. And I resonate. Your research resonates with me because I think I did go online to see like, were there other women living a similar experience? And there were, right? Like there were support groups about ending wanted pregnancies and things like that were very useful to me at the time. But it is it's like any kind of research when it comes to women's bodies and their experiences that's not well researched, or it's like very biased in a particular direction. So it's heartening to hear that, you did this work and it's so important, and that the richness of the stories that you captured, because I think so many people are looking to have their experiences heard and understood in a different way, right? So thank you. It was really great.
Okay, good. I'm glad that I was a little nervous just for everyone here. I've never done one of these before, so I hope that there was everyone took something from it and I didn't ramble too hard in one area or another. So
certainly not, Jenna. Thank you so much. So for those of you who have come today, thank you so much for coming and participating and being here. We have more Lunch and Learns coming up in August, I think, or not August, April. My brain is already in summer mode. In April, and two in May, I believe. So stay tuned for those announcements, and we hope to see you at future Research Center Lunch and Learns. So thank you, and thanks again, Jenna, for taking the time today.
thanks for having me.
Take care, everybody.